We come to the 37th presentation, and the theme for this entire 2014 year is the Parayana, which is a third level transform from something that occurred in the first century of the Common Era, occurred in the first century AD in India, when Jesus received a correspondence from one of the Greek kings in India, in the area known as Gandhara, and that king's name was Gondophares. And he wanted for what he heard about Jesus, for him to send a spiritual architect to build him a palace. One of the disciples of Jesus was Thomas, who we all revere now as St. Thomas. And St. Thomas was from Damascus, and he was an architect. And one of his helpers in architecture, like an assistant architect, was named Thaddeus. And in the New Testament, you'll find both Thomas and Thaddeus listed as two of the 12 disciples. So Jesus appointed Thomas to go to India in due time, and before he went, to make sure that Thaddeus was dispensed north into upper Mesopotamia, because a king there had written him also about having someone present the teachings that Jesus was delivering largely in Galilee and Judea, in his kingdom. And so after a period of about 5 years from the crucifixion, resurrection, and the emphasis is on resurrection, there came a watershed in 41 AD, which included, among other things, Thaddeus being sent to King Abdigar VII in what is today Turkey, but very close to what is today Armenia. And Thomas was scheduled to go to India. And while he was scheduled to go to India, another very powerful, famous disciple was scheduled to go to Ethiopia, and that was St. Matthew. So St. Thomas and St. Matthew were traveling companions. Very often the early disciples would go in pairs. And in order to get them from where they were in Jerusalem to Ethiopia and then India, arrangements had been made for them to take the caravan route down to the Gulf of Aqaba, and there they would be picked up by the great Egyptian shipping company that would take them all the way down the Red Sea, drop Matthew off on the Ethiopian coast, and then take Thomas all the way to the southern peninsula coast, the west coast of India, to what is today the province of Kerala, where there was a great Jewish spice trade ensemble. And the shipping company was owned by the richest Hellenistic Jewish family in Alexandria, who at that time had two very powerful brothers who were owners of it. The older brother was Philo of Alexandria, and the younger brother had a couple of sons, Marcus Julius Alexander and Tiberius Julius Alexander. Tiberius Julius Alexander became a very famous general. He is listed in the Encyclopedia Judaica of not following the religion of his fathers, because he had become a follower of Jesus in Alexandria's way, along with his brother Marcus and with his uncle Philo, and the father also, who made sure that one of the sons took over the shipping business, and that was Marcus Julius Alexandria. And the shipping would go from Alexandria down a tributary of the Nile and down the Nile to the Greek-Egyptian port of Koptos, and then overland by about 3-4 days to the port on the Red Sea, Myos Hormos. And from Myos Hormos, the shipping company would go all the way down, stopping at various ports like Berenice, which is in between where we would identify it as Sudan and Ethiopia, and then further down to Ethiopian ports that connected with what is today Yemen across the very narrow strait. And that whole district was still called Sheba, the Queen of Sheba. And it happened at that time in early 40 AD. There was a Queen Candace who had her caravan chief converted into being a follower of Jesus' way by the Apostle Philip, who met this caravan head in Judea and found that he could read Hebrew and that he was a descendant of the whole tradition going all the way back to King Solomon and Sheba, and their son Menelik, who became the first of the whole Ethiopian lineage that lasted into the 20th century. The 276th generation of the patrimony of Solomon and the Queen of Sheba, Menelik, in the 20th century was Haile Selassie. He was the 276th, and the subtitle of the King of Ethiopia, even into the 1930s, 40s, was the Lion of Judah. Menelik is the one who took the Ark of the Covenant from the temple in Jerusalem, because it was his patrimony, because Solomon, meantime, had had many wives, many concubines. There were all sorts of pretend inheritors. And so a duplicate of the Ark of the Covenant had to be made for the temple. The original went to Ethiopia and is still there. It's in Axum, which is a temple, a synagogue, cut into the solid rock. And later on, it was enlarged so that it was now in the shape of a cross to carry the tradition from Solomon to Jesus intact there. On the way, they exchanged gospels that they had just written in 41 AD. And Thomas took the early Gospel of Matthew with him to India, and Matthew kept the early Gospel of Thomas in Ethiopia, so that it eventually, over the centuries, passed into a Coptic Christian translation out of the original Greek. And the original manuscript of Matthew in Greek was in India. And in fact, a copy of the original manuscript was obtained by Pentheus in about 160 AD. He journeyed from the Alexandria of his day, where they could not find an unedited, untampered with Gospel of Matthew, he went all the way to India and got an original copy and brought it back, and then established the catechetical school in Alexandria. And his first group of students included Clement of Alexandria, and later on Origen, and many other very distinguished persons in the early Christianity. Almost all of them eclipsed when Christianity became a Roman Empire religion, and right away it changed to being the Holy Roman Church rather than being the way of Jesus. At any rate, Thomas, though he landed in the southern part, the tip of India originally, he proceeded by ship along the Malabar coast north all the way to Gandhara, which is in the Indus River landscape, which is today Pakistan. And there, Gandharis gave him an enormous sum of money to build him a spiritual church for the new vision of the way, and then went off for a year in military campaigns. And when he came back, there was no church. And so he put Thomas into prison. And then he discovered over the year or so or two that all of the people of Gandhara had morphed, had transformed, and had great veneration for Gandharis because the way had been taught to them by St. Thomas in such a convincing way that they all made a very healthy kingdom. And so Gandharis had Thomas released from prison because he realized his spiritual church was the people, the population who had been revivified, not only unified, but put into a whole spectrum, and that his kingdom was extremely fine. And so a coin was struck by his minting place. All the Greek kings minted coins, just like Greeks everywhere or Romans everywhere would mint coins. And on the portrait of Gandharis, where the Ajna chakra would be, there is an infinity sign. The eternity of the infinite word. In my Plates volume of Jesus in Alexandria, the second volume, there I have a blow-up of that coin. And I found in a study of Mithraic coins done in about 100 years ago by a French savant named Cumin, and one of those coins has, in a worn way, a portrait of the standing St. Thomas with a radiance for a halo and teaching. And it was mistaken by Cumin and mistaken by those who had delivered it to him that this was Mithraic, when actually it really is not Mithras, it is St. Thomas teaching. So all of these things are indications that one can reach back with veracity and re-establish a new past which is truer than it has ever been, even better and truer than in the times in which it occurred, and which very few people understood what was actual, what was really happening, what its significance was. And at the same time, that one has a new past in a kind of a chiral, recursive quality. The future also becomes more and more possible in a continuity, so that the future and the new past become a shared presencing rather than a cut-up time period. And that, as I have been pointing out, those persons who are able to do the new past and the future, not only with a symmetry, but with a presencing that dissolves the present into its continuity of veracity. And in doing so, those persons, I have borrowed a phrase from Louis de Broglie. I used to use the American pronunciation for his name, de Broglie, but it's de Broglie. Prince Louis de Broglie was one of the great physicists. He and his brother, Maurice, were great physicists, but Louis de Broglie was extremely famous, especially in the Solvay conferences in Belgium. He's the one who came up with the pilot wave theory based on solitons. It so happens, because this is the way veracity has its harmonic. Just today, Science Daily has an article, September 12th, just registered on early September 13th, 2014. Source, Massachusetts Institute of Technology. And its summary here. The central mystery of quantum mechanics is that small chunks of matter sometimes seem to behave like particles, sometimes like waves. For most of the past century, the prevailing explanation of this conundrum has been what's called the Copenhagen interpretation, which holds that in some sense, a single particle really is a wave smeared out across the universe that collapses into a determinate location only when observed. But some founders of quantum physics, notably Louis de Broglie, championed an alternative interpretation known as pilot wave theory. How current can you be? Which posits that quantum particles are borne along on some type of wave. According to pilot wave theory, the particles have definite trajectories, but because of the pilot wave's influence, they still exhibit wave-like statistics. What we're teaching here is up-to-date physics, is up-to-date cosmology, is updated everything in terms of a mature civilization. This would be best stated by me. This commonality of the particle within a quantum wave uncertainty occurs as phenomenal space-time to consciousness. It isn't just observation, but it is the consciousness that comes into play as a dimension, a fifth dimension, that not only allows for the pilot wave person to understand that they are now seeing a phenomenal particle to any degree of specificity whatsoever, but at the same time, in a symmetrical complementarity, they understand that this is a wave as well. And that the pilot wave theory, the way that we're understanding it in profound depth and recalibration, that's the right word for it, not just revolution, but recalibration, much stronger than revolution. There are always counter-revolutions. A recalibration allows for the accuracy to be as minute or as expanded as one would like, including down to and in zero, and up to, including into infinity. And that the arbiter as a threshold between these two fields is a phenomenal idea known as one. the number one, or the singleness of numeracy, or the singularity of a universe, of a one verse, a one place. And it is this quality of being a pilot wave person that enables there to be a recalibration of education to learning. That an education is an integral only, truncated partiality, and that learning is a conduit that is able to have its flow into further dimensions. The first further dimension is the ability to vision, not daydream, not project, but to envision. And the envisioning brings into play a constellation, an emerged constellation of a person, a pilot wave person, who prismatically then, like a very sophisticated crystal, like a very precious gem, a jewel, is able, through refining their facets of prismatic understanding and expression, their creative imagination and their remembering becomes ever more refined, so that as more and more facets are made through a cutting, and the original cutting is a phrase that was only and first used by Philo of Alexandria, vis-a-vis the teacher that he was able to study under for the first time in Alexandria, and that was Jesus in Alexandria. The phrase that Philo uses is the logos cutter. The word, meaning that language which is spoken, that spoken word is able not only to cut, but the phrase that Philo uses in his treatise on the contemplative life, a first-hand witness of the young Jesus teaching, just outside of Alexandria, about 20-25 miles, in Taposiris Magna, on Lake Mareotis. Philo says that there occurs, as he prepares to speak, a silence that deepens to a silence within a silence. And in that silence within a silence, what he speaks, his words, his oral language, the word does the cutting. It is the logos cutter. And the teaching is not a teaching in education. It is a refinement of learning. And so this refinement continually refines, so that the person, instead of being just ultimately an individual, becomes more and more faceted and becomes prismatic, jewel-like, so that the entire spectrum of possibility in the universe is available to them. Instead of just having an Aristotelian physics, one now has a transform to a different kind of a physics. Popularly, the Aristotelians used to call it a metaphysics. But it isn't a metaphysics. It is, in fact, a refined, we would call it now a quantum, not a quantum mechanics so much, but a quantum wisdom complementarity that allows for us more and more facets, so that we have now qualities coming out in publications. The latest issue of Nature, the international science journal for over 130 years, has a cover story now of Laniakea. Laniakea is the new cosmology, that our Milky Way galaxy is an almost tiny dot on this middle protrusion from this wonderful shape that looks very much like the kind of windswept clouds that were considered angelic beings. This angelic being is 500 million light years across. And as we talked about last week, has a complement, has a twin that's called the Perseus Pisces Supergalactic cluster, and the two of them together are 1 billion light years across. That in the new cosmos now, because we can measure millions of stars' dynamics, their movement within a superior astrophysical kind of super duper spectrographic computation and understanding, we can understand that this is altogether but a corner of the known universe. And now we are able to understand that with pilot wave theory, with Laniakea, and the new supercluster of hundreds of millions of galaxies at a time in groupings, in pairs of groupings, and further, that we can recalibrate the way in which we now experience, characterize, practice, and learn about our entire species. And this new refinement that continues, that Logos cutter, which in India became the Vajra Chadika, the jewel cutter, and that cutting the jewel of the person to refinement was the way in which the diamond way led to a development of the great way, the Mahayana, into the beginnings of the Vajrayana. And the very first threshold of that we can date as in our calendar numbering, 868 AD in China. That is the date of the first printed book in the world. Not just a written language book in an alphabet, but the first book ever printed. The Vajrachadika Sutra is the watershed where the Mahayana morphs into the Vajrayana, into the diamond way. And that diamond way began to bear fruit because those who were able to understand the Vajrachadika Sutra also had kept for many hundreds of years a small outrigger like a pilot light of the Vajrachadika, and that was the Heart Sutra, the Hridaya Sutra. Hri, heart, Daya, the refining heart, the compassionate heart. And the Heart Sutra has as its thematic refrain all the way through in Sanskrit, Gati, Gati, Paragati, Bodhisvaha. Svaha is like an interjection of behold. Gone, gone, completely gone. Enlightenment, behold. In the Vajrachadika, It has a Homeric structure, very much like the Iliad, or some of the other compositions of classical Greek, where the beginning and the end make a grand symmetry. And as one moves from the beginning into it, one could recursively move from the end back into it, and they form with parentheses within parentheses, like old Russian dolls used to be. Or if you're born like me in the 1940s, the schmoes used to fit one into another from little Abner cartoons. So that at the very center of the Vajrachedika, like at the very center of the Iliad, is the event that starts, the pebble in the pond, all of these ripples, that the beginning and the end, so-called, were the same. Jesus said of himself quite clearly, I am the Alpha and the Omega. I'm the beginning and the end. That this entire harmonic has a source, has a pilot source, an axial pilot source. And I am that person. So that the pilot wave persons have this quality of being able to enter into a dimensional scalar of reality that is large enough to be able to behold Laniakeas, to be able to behold again, revisiting pilot wave theory in mid-September 2014. All of this needs to be learnable for civilization to continue. That the complications, the power, the obstructions, the vast coming powers, which are just now beginning to surface, the ability to manipulate the entire genome of inheritance, the ability to make not just hydrogen bombs, but to totally disrupt and destroy all life on the planet. All of this cannot be curtailed by any persons, any group, any power, any source of ideology whatsoever within that collapsing structure, because structures in civilization, unlike the shapes of culture, culture is based on nature, but civilizations are based on the development of the arts and the sciences, on these further dimensions. And when they are in jeopardy and collapsible, the collapse is so huge, it's like the Twin Towers in New York City with 9/11, that the very weight of their collapse collapses all the way down to the ground and leaves but just shards in the ground. It goes back to the last stable place before the collapse. And the last stable place before the collapse here is a lawless barbarity that makes a dystopia look like a trip to Knott's Berry Farm. There is no way that this does not happen without the learning and the refinement, the double refinement. The coming into vision to make the art of being a person, the coming further into history to make the science refine so that it becomes real. So that the person and the cosmos are intimately related. This is why learning now has to receive all of the endeavor that education up until 2014 has claimed for itself. Erroneously. Because in going back into the past it becomes apparent to someone who is able to see on these large scalars that the time forms of civilization have a geometry. One of the most puzzling of all of the sayings of Pythagoras is that geometry is history. The Greek phrase was ipsa dixit, he said it. The reported sayings of Pythagoras, like St. Thomas's logoi of the living Jesus. He said this. This is what he said in 114 logoi. It is a quality that is able to have been understood poignantly at high points in the frequency wave of civilization that takes about 2,000 years for it to run its signature cycle. And in the middle of that is the millennium, and in the middle of the millennium is what used to be called the age of the phoenix, every 500 years. And because it begins with a downward thrust to a trough that then rises back to the beginning horizon, which is the millennium, and then crests, so that the crest and the troughs are symmetrical. The 500 years before the millennium, the 500 years after the millennium, have a curious kind of a quality. We call that crest a renaissance. And in civilization on this planet, there have been three great renaissances. 2500 BC, 500 BC, 1500 AD. And the Renaissance then rushes renewed back to the horizon to renew the time form in its completeness. Its half completeness is the millennium, but its full completeness is the aeon. We're going to take a little break and come back. What is being delivered here is a good news, a timely news. The Parayana is the transform of the Vajrayana into history, where the Vajrayana was a translation of the vision and art of the Mahayana into the developments that led to the history and science. The first transform is making the wine out of water. The second is making the cognac distilled out of the wine. We're now ready to distill that essence in that refinement, the liqueur that is life-giving. Let's take a little break. We're coming back to an interesting beginning in this week's presentation, beginning with the latest science news. One of the rare websites a friend of mine in Boston follows is Natural Society, and it has a headline article, Mad Science, Genetically Modified Microhumans to be Farmed for Drug Testing by 2017. And the bold, finer print, developers of artificial microhumans, or mini GM humans, are hoping to release their technology on the market by 2017. No, this isn't a sci-fi joke. Scientists are developing artificial humans in the same vein as GM plants, with the hope that these creations will replace the need for using animals in laboratory testing. Presumably, mankind itself is too recalcitrant to be farmed in this way. So that we have Dr. Moreau, not only on his island, but on his globe, working. That was a theme of a very famous science fiction story by Theodore Sturgeon, entitled Microcosmic God. This is volume 2 out of 14 volumes published in Berkeley by North Atlantic Books. Richard Grossinger is the publisher. Microcosmic God appeared in April 1941 of Astounding Science Fiction magazine. I remember when I began my summer solstice celebrations in 1980, after being out of university level teaching for about 5 years, I used to always deliver a summer solstice celebration, and the first one included a who's who in the front row of about 70 or 80 people, and Theodore Sturgeon was there, one of them. A.E. Van Vogt was there, Kai D was there, many others. It is about someone on a Pacific island who makes many very tiny human being-like creatures who, because they're small and they reproduce quickly and they go through their generations quickly, the creator in the laboratory becomes the god of these creatures with very surprising developments. I use these science stories. This one borders on the ridiculous. And yet, if one remembers back into the 1950s, there were always those kinds of sardonic genius comics who would take ordinary qualities of things and work with them. Lenny Bruce used to come to his nightclub appearances in a kind of a blue seersucker summer coat and sit down with the evening's newspaper and begin, no tie, open, to just read from it and to be able to ad lib. Another was Mort Saul, who was able just to take the qualities of the peculiarities of life going on all about us. One of the great recorded Mort Saul riffs is in a film from about 1952 called All the Young Men, starring Alan Ladd and one of the first screen appearances of Sidney Poitier, a Marine outfit in North Korea during the Korean War that gets separated, and the commander of the unit is killed, and they retreat to a kind of a monastery where it was a convent monastery in the mountains, and they're being chased by these North Korean Chinese troops. And they have to have the leadership of this World War II veteran played by Alan Ladd. And among his group is Sidney Poitier and Mort Saul and the boxing champion of the world at that time, Swede. All of the people involved in this are incredible. It turns out that the next commanding officer is mortally wounded, and the only way to save him is through a blood transfusion. And Sidney Poitier, black, is the only one that has that blood type. And one of the Southern members threatens him with death if they use this blood to save this white man. Anyway, it's a complicated story, but Mort Saul has, in the midst of this looming tragedy, one of the great sardonic, humorous monologues in world film. If you ever get a chance to see it or find it, All the Young Men. So with Mort Saul and Lenny Bruce, we come to something which is not tragic, nor is it comic, but is realistic. And that is, learning must be the transform of education that was always limited. It was always limited to an integral cycle. It began, surely enough, of having some kind of natural concourse, who knows how many tens of thousands of years ago, but about 40,000 years ago, our kind morphed into Homo sapiens sapiens, wise about being wise. And it's the first time that there's a development of the ability to have a visionary dimension expressed in a personal dimension, an artistic dimension. It's the first time that you get cave paintings. It's the first time that you get sculptures. And one finds this quality resurging during that whole time period of 40,000 years ago into almost, as we would say, recent times, where the cultures began to displace the hunting groups, and even on the tribal level about 12,000 years ago. And slowly the cultures built, and through taming the animals and taming the plants, taming the cultural milieu for those involved in these traditions, in these customs, the customs being the rituals and the phenomena, the tradition being the myths and the mythic horizon of feeling tones and images that are appropriate to the way in which this story cycle tells us of the annual cycle, the seasonal changes, the commemorations, and so forth, and the development slowly of a larger and larger symbolic structure of thought to be able to remember through a memory and to feel through an image base and to express through a refining language until there came a transition from the visual images that were abstracted to become signs, that those signs began then to have a related, constellated meaning, and eventually led about 6,350 years ago to a discursive written language. That discursive written language refined itself for several thousand years, and about 4,000 years ago, about 2000 BC, was the beginnings of the development of a selection of sounds into letters of an alphabetic written language. No longer like a cuneiform, no longer like pictographs, but this is the way in which we would speak it, but it's written so that you can write it thinking of it being read with an inner voice. And then one could lift it off the page into a declamation voice that is choreographed by the writing. It is this quality that by 2000 BC swiftly became a new quality. It was like a new aeon. Just as written language originally, preceded by about 350 years the development of an aeonic emergence as a carrier wave based on the refinement of a reference wave. And so you have this kind of do-si-do, where an improvement in language becomes a reference wave, a facility to utilize that improved written language so that it becomes more and more capable. Some 2,000 years BC was the first time that there was a written language that was discursive enough to carry a very high wisdom. One of the earliest developments of that was about 1925 BC, which we have talked about many times in these presentations. A contemporary of Abraham, who had the vision of the promised land, about 1925 BC, he was 75 roughly. About the same time, and in a parallel way, a man who was the inheritor of very extensive caravan routes and quite wealthy in the written language of Avesta. His name was Zarathustra. Zarat is like very good. Ustra in Avestan was camels. Meant that he could run really good caravan routes because they would go far and always return and always bring the goods out and take the goods to them. And so the trade routes grew, and so Zarathustra, as we would pronounce it today in English, at about 75, had left Central Asia around where Samarkand traditionally was, and had married an Afghan princess. And in what is today Kabul, had written his songs, his gathas. In Avestan, gatha is song. Sanskrit, which is a later version of the pronunciation of Avestan in Sanskrit, which was made as a written language in India to develop the Avestan script in India. The word is Gita. Gatha became Gita, Bhagavad Gita, the song of the Lord. The gathas are the songs. And in the gathas, there are subgroupings called yasnas, and the yasnas collect together into the way in which one would express a sacred ambulation through a written language which is read silently with the inner voice, can be lifted off the page with an oral voice so that one has the occurrence of the ecology of a poetic. It is written, meant to be read comprehensively silently, is meant to be in a complementarity with reading it out loud orally, so that the hearing orally and the seeing contemplatively not just mesh together as a new synthesis, as a new integral, but pair as a complementarity so that one can move freely between myths, the mythic horizon of oral language, and symbols, the ability to have a written language through the medium of sharing, which is vision, which is differential consciousness as another dimension coming into play. The very beginning of the gathas, yasna 28, the whole grouping of 7 yasnas makes this a group called the Ahuna Vahiti, that one has been able to hear and now read. To hear and to see through the hearing. To read and read into the hearing, so that comprehension is able to move intersensually, and so that all of the senses begin to come into play with a transforming fifth dimension, a magical quality. This is how the Gathas begin. 28, they're numbered because they were all misnumbered over the several thousands. It's been 4,000 years since they were written. To the highest I pray, with hands spread aloft. To Spirit Mazda, first and pure, in Asha as ordered deeds, our good Harad mind, this pleases creation's soul. Harad in Avestan means the quality, a power of manifesting, similar to Te in Chinese, Tao Te Ching. It is the oneness in strict wholeness, but it's manifesting the oneness, not just one, but the oneness which can be distributed through many qualities, many things. And so Harad is like Te, the power to make manifest. Later on in this yasna, one finds this quality. So with all of us in Asha, guardian of good eternity mind, you, Mazda Ahura, teach me your own self words, the spirit through your voice, the thusness of first existence. And so this quality of being able to hear in an oral language that has a supraliterate quality where it exceeds even the rhetoric of a written language into the poetic of a language which is written, even translated, my translation of Zarathustra into 21st century American English. More than a decade spent of doing the original translation and another decade or two to refine it. This quality of a poetic transforms education into a learning which requires a poetic to transform what a rhetoric was already bringing into an order. A quality of rhetorical structure is the ability to plan out what one is going to say by planning out what one is going to write. And in this way, there is a composition. And that plan, that composing, has then the laws of composition. It has the way in which one teaches one how to write using the right rhetorical way. How to then declaim rhetorically, accurately, what is here according to the rules of grammar, the selection of vocabulary, the emphasis in subject, the way in which the subject is given a discipline of development. And it is this way that the transition from culture to civilization progressed until about 2,000 years ago, that it became apparent that the new carrier wave was introducing a fantastic transform that there could be multiple meanings of a sophisticated, prismatic way of writing, that the poetic now is being developed, having a personal voice. The Renaissance of that 2,000 years ago was about 500 BC, 2,500 years ago. And that Renaissance is one of the great renaissances in civilization on this planet. You had the poetic refining of language in its multiple meanings. You had Pythagoras, you had Lao Tzu and Confucius, you had Ezekiel, you had the revival of Zarathustra as Zoroaster, you had an entire entourage that then is a renaissance leading to this new carrier wave 500 years later that returns back to the creative horizon of civilization, empowered by this new realization that over these 2,000 years, coming through all of the vicissitudes to the promise in its, through its trough, back through its millennial jeopardy, into its Renaissance crest, and back to where a carrier wave can reoccur in terms of starting a new, not a cycle so much, but a new energy. So that this energy, this frequency, this long wave is time. So that when we talk about waves as energy, we are talking about time. And that time has forms. And that the very first dimension then of manifesting, of occurring, is that time comes into play. And as time comes into play spontaneously, from a natural field which one could only characterize as zero, not a 0 point. There are no 0 points. 0 points vanish. A zero field has the ability to have a creative condensation, a creative vibe in time, so that it begins to have its rhythm. Very, very, very slow, very, very, very long. But as soon as time comes into play, instantly the three dimensions of space blossom. And as they blossom, they carry time as a wave with them, so that one has space-time. You never have a pure space, just a three-dimensional space. That is truly abstract. You have what Einstein understood through several insights just before him. You have space-time. And space-time as a fabric is able to be given curvature by mass. But not only curvature by mass, what curves also in this is that space-time curves. And as space-time curves, it's giving over its energy, its dimensions to space. When space-time curves so much, it becomes a well where the horizontal fabric curves, and it becomes such a deep well that eventually the carrier of electromagnetic energy in space-time, the photon, can no longer be carried. And one has, as one says, a black hole. Or one has microscopic black holes, or one has this kind of dark matter quality of space that is just barely in time, barely as space-time, and does not have yet the particality that precipitates out. It's like a plasma out of which all of the salt has been dissolved in the water, and so it is not just a fluid, but it is a solution. The ancient alchemical term that we still use is that to a problem there is a solution. Not abstracted to a question and then an answer, but given a refined, transformative understanding that for every problem, the solution is to take the problem back to its origins in this very solute out of which it must have emerged, and carry it forward in like kind so that it can be understood not only in its development, in its evolution into being what it is, but further of its being what it will be. And so the quality about 350 years ago, which is the new reference wave for our carrier wave, was the ability for language to have a written calculus, to move from the 0 to the 1, or move from the 1 to the 0, and that this is not only ambidextrous, but has a chiral complementarity, where the integral computation and the differential computation are two hands of the same application. But the experience of working with it shows that the by far largest computation comes in not to just the integral or the differential, but to the partial differential. If one goes to reference books for calculus, the largest tome is differential equation, partial differential equations. Immense. Hundreds and hundreds, almost 1,000 pages. I'll bring one next week so you can see. That led, just before our carrier wave of 1991, to the development of a digital written language, using the zeros and one as pairs, and using that pairedness as the ability to express, not abstractly, but computationally, so that it can be accessed through a computer. The very first mechanical computer in this light was built by John von Neumann. It was built in the 1940s, the late 1940s. And he called it a differential analyzer. It was like a huge table, 25 feet by 15 feet, filled with various calibrated rods and appendages and so forth, that when they spun, almost like a complex clockwork, they were able to take any kind of a digitized problem fed into this immense new calibration, a differential analyzer, and run through and to bring out in computer language the solution. The early transform of differential analyzers was to take it out of the mechanical application into the electronic. And the first electronic application was ENIAC around almost 1950. so that one began to have the speed of the electron into the calculation. And we're on the cusp now of those pairs being paired as qubits, which would be a quantum computer, having facility that dwarfs what we consider a supercomputer now. The sourcing of this is not just the brain, but it is the expansion into dimensions of the brain. So that consciousness, differential consciousness, is a whole ecology of dimensions that refine the brain just like one would refine computers, even quantum computers, so that it is possible, in fact, it's workable for human beings, men and women, to be super duper computers without any electronics whatsoever. And that computation is spontaneous. It's quicker than instantaneous. The phrase in St. John in the Apocalypse, the book of Revelation, again and again, he is told by the angel of the presence, the Lord says, "Behold, I come quickly." The quickly is understood as kind of fast. It is spontaneously faster than instant. In the development of the Mahayana, right at the time that the Vajrayana was just beginning to occur, there was a development that brought in many currents and produced Chan, or the Japanese pronunciation of it, Zen. And the figure then was Huineg, and he's the first one to express orally and have it written down as he spoke the sudden enlightenment of the Southern School of Chan. This was in the early 600s AD. This is exactly at the time when Muhammad was beginning his visions that led to Islam, that Tang Tai Tsung Li Shimin was founding the Tang dynasty, so that the reference waves of about 650 AD are extraordinarily powerful, so that the reference wave of 1650 AD of Newton and Leibniz and calculus, of that mathematical true reference wave, the reference wave for the aeon, gets confused with the reference wave for the millennium of 650 AD, for the millennium of 1000 AD. So what leads that reference wave to expect is the events of 1000 AD. In the Middle East, what they're expecting is that they're in the midst of new crusades. Not of space travel, not of a new humanity that is going into worlds beyond a planet, but an incursion both in Islam and in dynastic China, etc. So we face a default nightmare by not having learned well. More next week.